Montana Territory. Summer of 1878, the sun had barely risen, but the smoke rising from the old cabin at the edge of Dry Creek Ridge already told a story of something gone wrong. Evelyn Dorsey stood just beyond the smoldering wreckage, arms clasped around her two children. Her dress was torn, her knuckles scraped, and her brown eyes were steady despite the flames fading behind her. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears never changed much. "Mama," her youngest Hazel whispered. She was 7, barefoot, with a thin braid falling down her back. "I know, baby," Evelyn murmured, brushing soot from Hazel's cheek. Beside her, her older boy, Henry 10 and already too serious, watched the road like he expected the world to come crashing down next. That world had already taken enough from them. Her husband had left 3 winters ago, riding off with a bottle and never coming back. The land had dried up, and the neighbors stopped looking her in the eye when she came to town. Now the cabin was gone, set alight last night by someone too bitter to leave a widow and her children in peace. She had no money, no kin, nothing but 2 small hands clutching hers and a sharp ache in her chest that said she had failed them. Again, they started walking just after dawn, with the smoke behind them and the mountains ahead. Evelyn did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. By noon, the sun was high and cruel. The prairie stretched empty for miles, except for a faint trail leading west. Evelyn's boots were worn thin. Hazel begged to be carried after her feet blistered. Henry offered to walk ahead to look for shelter, but Evelyn shook her head. "We stay together," she said. "Always." They crested a slope and saw a rider on the horizon, a lone figure on horseback, moving slow like he was not in any rush. Evelyn pulled the children behind her, her heart thudding with unease. She reached for the old rifle strapped across her back, empty, but she hoped it would not come to that. The rider came closer, and when he saw them, he halted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat and a weather-worn duster. His horse was dark and sturdy, dust caked on its flanks. He dismounted, keeping his hands visible. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm. "You need help?" Evelyn did not answer at first. She looked him over, searching for danger. He looked young, maybe 30, with sunburned skin and a faint scar across his left cheek. His eyes were the color of the sky before a storm, sharp, unreadable. "I got 2 children," she said. "We ain't askin' for handouts." "I did not offer a handout," he said. "I asked if you needed help." Henry stepped forward. "Our cabin burned down last night." The cowboy's gaze flicked to the boy, then to Evelyn. "I'm Holden Callahan. I got a ranch about 6 miles west." "You're welcome to rest there." Evelyn stared at him. "Why?" he shrugged. "Because I can." That night they slept in his barn, warm hay under their backs, the scent of horses and safety mixing in the air. He brought them food without asking questions. When Hazel fell asleep curled against her brother, Evelyn stepped outside. Holden was sitting on a bale, sharpening a knife under the moonlight. "You do this often?" she asked. He looked up. "Bring strangers in?" "No." "Then why us?" He hesitated, then said, "Because you looked like you had nowhere left to go, and I've known that feeling." She did not reply. Instead, she leaned against the beam and stared at the stars, arms crossed. "I ain't good enough for a home," she said quietly. "Never been. Not since I was 16 and ran off with the wrong man." Holden's hand stilled. He looked over at her, expression unreadable. "Then let me prove you wrong." Evelyn's breath caught. She had not expected that, not from a stranger, not from a man who owed her nothing. He stood, not moving closer, just giving her space. "You and the children can stay here, for as long as you need. Keep to yourselves if that is what you want, or help out around the place. No strings." "You do not know me," she said. "I will," he answered. "If you let me." In the days that followed, she did not let herself believe him, but she stayed. She helped fix the chicken coop. She mended one of his shirts. Henry started following him around the barn, asking questions about horses. Hazel laughed for the first time in weeks when Holden lifted her onto the back of a mare and taught her how to hold the reins. Evelyn stayed quiet, watching. Every night, she sat beside the fire after the children had gone to bed, and Holden would offer her a seat across from him. Sometimes they talked about the land, about the cattle, about the weather. Sometimes they said nothing at all. He never pushed, never asked for anything. But when she looked at him, she saw something steady there, something kind. One afternoon, she was hanging laundry behind the house when he came around the corner, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You fixed that shirt better than I ever could," he said. She gave a one-shoulder shrug. "Used to do all the sewing back home." He nodded, then looked at her, really looked. "This place it is not much, but it is yours if you want it." She shook her head. "I cannot take your kindness. That is not how I was raised." "Maybe not," he said, stepping closer. "But I would sure like to be the one to show you different." Their eyes met. He did not touch her, did not lean in. Just waited, and for the first time in years, Evelyn did not step back. He was quiet when he spoke again. "You are not broken. You are just tired, and I have room here for all three of you." She blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. "You do not even know what you are taking on." He smiled, soft and real. "I do, and I am not scared." She looked down at her hands, then lifted her chin and met his eyes. "Then maybe I am not scared either." Holden reached for her hand, slow and careful, and she let him take it. That night, when she tucked the children in on the blankets laid out in the barn loft, Henry looked up at her. "Is Mr. Callahan going to be around for a while?" Evelyn brushed his hair back. "I think so," Hazel whispered. "He smells like horses." Evelyn laughed for the first time in a long time. "Yes, he does." And when she stepped outside, the moon was high, and Holden was there waiting, just like always. Neither of them said a word. But when she leaned into his side, he wrapped an arm around her shoulder, and it felt like the beginning of something she never thought she would have again. The next morning broke cool, with a thin mist clinging low over the pasture. Evelyn stepped out of the barn with Hazel bundled on her hip, her breath showing in the early air. The mountains in the distance wore a blue hush, and the fields rolled out quiet, dew silvering the grass. Holden was already at the corral, tossing feed to the horses, his coat slung over the fence post nearby. He turned as she approached, brushing his hands clean on his trousers. "You sleep all right?" Evelyn shifted Hazel's weight and glanced back toward the barn. Henry was up before light. "Said he wanted to help." "He's got a good eye," Holden said. "Asked me why the roan was favoring his left leg. Not many noticed that." She didn't answer right away, just took in the land. Fences needed mending, and the west field looked like it hadn't been turned in a while. The place carried the wear of a man on his own, but it was kept with care. It felt lived in, not abandoned. "You run this place by yourself?" she asked, stepping closer. "Mostly." He leaned against the fence, one boot propped up on the rail. "Had a hand last year, but he lit out come spring. Decided Arizona suited him better." "You ever think of selling?" His brow lifted. "And do what? Move to town and play cards with men who ain't worked a day in months?" Evelyn gave a low sound, almost a laugh. "Suppose that wouldn't suit you?" "Not hardly," he said. "This land's got its own rhythm. Just needs someone to keep time with it." She shifted her weight, adjusting Hazel's blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What made you stay?" Holden studied her a moment, then looked past her toward the barn. "My brother died out here. Took a fall breaking a wild colt. After that, I couldn't leave it to go to weeds. Felt like walking away would be leaving him all over again." Evelyn's arms tightened around her daughter. "You and he were you close?" "Not always," Holden said, voice low. "But toward the end, yeah." He had plans for this place, drawings for a new lean-to, a windmill, I never had the head for that sort of thing, but I've been trying to carry the rest. Evelyn nodded slowly. It's a good thing you're doing. He looked at her then, steady and quiet. You do the same. You already have. She didn't know what to say to that, so she looked away, toward the cottonwood trees that marked the edge of the creek. After breakfast, Holden showed Henry how to saddle one of the older mares. Evelyn watched from the porch, arms crossed, as her son followed each instruction with careful attention. Hazel played in the dust near the steps with a pine cone, humming to herself. Holden didn't say much while he worked with Henry, only offered a nod or a gesture when the boy got it right. When Henry managed to tighten the cinch without fumbling, Holden gave him a quick pat on the back and handed him the bridle. Later, when Henry was brushing the mare down, Evelyn stood beside Holden at the paddock rail. He's been different, she said. Since we got here, calmer. Holden nodded. Children feel it when things settle. She glanced at him. You always been this patient, he smiled faintly. No, took some hard lessons to get here. There was a time I'd have shouted first and listened later. Evelyn studied his profile, the sun picking out the lighter strands in his hair, the faint line just above his brow that hadn't been there yesterday. You don't seem like a man chasing anything anymore. I'm not, he said. I'm waiting. For what? For someone to see this place the way I do. That evening, while the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned to copper, Evelyn took a bucket from the well and started scrubbing the porch boards with a rag and lye. Her hands worked quick and firm, sleeves rolled to her elbows, skirt tied back. Holden leaned against the post after supper, watching without interrupting. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she replied, not looking up. But I want it to feel clean. He stepped down, crouched beside her, and took the rag from her hands. Let me help. She blinked, surprised, but nodded. They worked side by side until the porch gleamed, their hands red and raw from the scrubbing. When they finished, she leaned back on her heels and exhaled. Feels better. He sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. You thinking of staying? She hesitated. I don't know yet. I'm not used to asking myself what I want. Holden turned toward her, his voice low. What if I asked you to stay? She looked at him then, really looked. I told you I've made choices that don't leave room for second chances. And I told you, he said, I aim to prove you wrong. She stared at him, heart thudding slow and heavy. Then she reached out and touched his hand, just for a moment. His fingers curled around hers, not pulling, just holding. Inside, the children's voices drifted down from the loft, soft and content. The lantern on the porch cast a warm circle around them. Evelyn didn't say anything more that night. She didn't need to. Holden didn't press. They sat there in the quiet, hands entwined, the scent of clean wood rising around them, and something unspoken settled between them, solid as earth, steady as the ridge line. By mid-September, the last of summer's heat had softened into a dry, golden warmth. The cottonwoods by the creek had begun to yellow at the edges, and the mornings came with a hush that only autumn knew how to hold. Evelyn stood at the edge of the west field, her skirt caught lightly in the wind. She held a small wooden box in her hands. Holden had handed it to her that morning without explanation, just a quiet nod and a glance toward the barn. Inside was a spool of thread, a needle roll, 2 buttons, and a folded scrap of gingham cloth. She ran her fingers along the worn lid. You fixin' to make me useful? Holden leaned against the fence post beside her, arms crossed. No, ma'am, just figured you'd want your own place to keep things. She looked up at him, eyes narrowing slightly. I'm not a guest anymore, you're not, he said, voice even. Least not to me. Evelyn turned the box over in her hands, then tucked it under her arm. You ever think about what comes after all this? After the cattle are sold, the fences mended, the fields turned? Sure, he said. I think about planting windbreaks, building a shed for the tack. Maybe setting some fruit trees along the slope. She gave a short laugh. That ain't what I meant. I know. His voice lowered. I think about sitting on that porch with someone beside me, watching the light go long over the grass. She turned her head away. You don't know what I've done to crawl this far. I don't need to, he said. You've crawled far enough. You can stand now. She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. Later that week, while Holden rode into town for salt and flour, Evelyn took the children to the creek. Hazel picked smooth stones and lined them up in rows along the bank. Henry balanced on a fallen log, arms stretched wide. Evelyn knelt beside the water, scrubbing one of Holden's shirts against a flat rock. You think he'll let us stay through winter? Henry asked, eyes fixed on the water's current. He hasn't said otherwise, Evelyn replied. He listens to you, Henry said. He doesn't talk just to hear himself. She wrung out the shirt and laid it over the brush to dry. That doesn't mean he's made promises. But you smile more, Henry said, hopping down from the log. And you don't always look behind us anymore. Evelyn looked at her son then, really looked. He was tall for 10, but his wrists were still thin and his eyes held more weight than they should have. She reached out, brushing his hair back from his face. I don't want to lose another place, he said quietly. You won't, she said. Not if I can help it. When Holden returned that evening, he brought more than supplies. A man rode with him older with a stiff leg and a long rifle across his saddle. Holden introduced him as Emery, a neighbor from 2 ridges over. We trade stock sometimes, Holden explained. He's got a bull I might borrow come spring. Emery tipped his hat to Evelyn. Heard about your trouble, he said. Folks up near Deadman's Creek been dealing with rustlers lately. Could be the same kind, Evelyn's jaw set. They set fire to what was left of my life. Holden stepped beside her, hand brushing lightly against hers. They won't touch this one. Good, Emery said. You've got something worth keeping here. He glanced at Holden, then back to Evelyn. Both of you. After the men headed to the barn to unload the feed, Evelyn stood alone on the porch, arms wrapped around herself. Hazel was asleep inside, curled on a wool blanket, and Henry had gone out to check the snares he'd set near the tree line. The sky over the hills was streaked with the pale pinks of evening. A dusting of birds wheeled through the air, wings catching the last light. Holden returned, stepping up onto the porch with a quiet tread. You're thinking hard, he said. Just wondering how long something good can last before the world decides to take it. It doesn't get to decide, he said. Not anymore. Evelyn looked up at him, her voice soft. You sure of that? I've never been surer of anything, he said. I've worked this land with my hands. Buried blood in it. I know what's real when I see it. She stepped closer, her voice no louder than the wind. I've carried shame like a stone in my pocket since I was a girl. I've been called things I won't let my daughter hear. And I've worn out every welcome I ever had. You haven't worn out mine, he said. And you won't. She stared at him, eyes shining, but her chin stayed high. The girl said, I ain't good enough for a home. And the cowboy said, Holden replied, voice rough with feeling, then let me prove you wrong. Evelyn reached for him slowly, deliberately. Her hand rested against his chest, over the place his heart beat steady and sure. He covered her hand with his own, grounding her. They stood like that, close and quiet, as the sky deepened to indigo and the stars began to prick through. When Henry returned, his boots dusty and his hands full of empty snares, he paused at the edge of the yard. He saw them on the porch, standing close, and after a moment he smiled and stepped inside without a word. Holden turned his head slightly. That boy's got his mother's strength. Evelyn leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. No, she said. He's got yours. And for the first time, she let herself believe the fire was behind her. What lay ahead unfolding slow as dusk felt like something that could last. The first frost came quiet, dusting the fields in white before sunrise. Evelyn stood at the sink inside the cabin Holden's cabin, though she no longer thought of it that way, and watched the breath of the cattle rise in slow puffs across the eastern pasture. The children still slept in the loft above, and the only sound was the low, steady ticking of the mantel clock Holden's mother had left behind years ago. She rinsed her hands in the basin and dried them on her apron. Holden had gone out before dawn to check the fence line north of the ridge, where a few posts had leaned crooked after last week's windstorm. He'd left a note on the table, not in writing, but a small bundle of jerky wrapped in cloth beside her coffee tin, a quiet way of saying he'd be back before noon. She wasn't used to a man leaving anything behind but silence. Outside, the porch boards creaked under her boots as she stepped out into the cold. The sky was clear, pale blue at the edges, and the grass crackled underfoot where the frost hadn't yet melted. A hawk circled high above the far field, slow and sure. Evelyn crossed to the coop and checked for eggs. Hazel had started taking to the hens, naming each one and refusing to eat any bird she'd spoken to directly. Evelyn hadn't argued. It felt good to see her daughter care for something without fear. She returned with 3 eggs in her skirt pocket and a handful of feathers clinging to her sleeves. As she stepped back into the kitchen, she found Henry sitting at the table, boots unlaced and hair sticking up at odd angles. "You were up early," she said, setting the eggs down. "I couldn't sleep," he replied, eyes on the window. "I kept thinking about the calf that limps. The one with the split hoof. Mr. Callahan said we might try binding it." Evelyn poured water into the kettle. "You want to go with him next time he checks on it?" Henry turned to her. "Can I?" "I think he'd be glad for the help." Henry nodded, then rubbed at his eyes. "I don't think I want to move again." She didn't answer right away. Her fingers stilled on the tin of flour. "We might not have to." Later that afternoon, Holden returned with wind-reddened cheeks and a coil of new wire slung over his shoulder. Evelyn was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the last of the coals back to life for supper. He stepped inside without knocking, as he always did now, and set his things near the door. "You got that fire burning just right," he said. She glanced up. "Only took me 5 tries." He crouched beside her, rolling the sleeves of his shirt to the elbow. "You ever see one of those cast iron stoves they got up in Fort Benton? Some trader's wife was boasting hers could bake 3 loaves at once." "I wouldn't trust a stove I couldn't see the flames in," Evelyn said, feeding another stick to the fire. Holden chuckled low. "I said the same thing." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Henry wants to help you with the calf. He's got an eye for detail." "He's steady," Holden said. "Doesn't rush things." Neither of them spoke for a beat. The fire crackled between them. Holden reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a scrap of folded paper. "Emery passed this to me yesterday. There's a man out east asking around about a woman with 2 children. Says he's owed something." Evelyn's back straightened. "What name?" He wouldn't say, just described you plain, brown-eyed, tall, wears her worry like a shawl. She didn't flinch, but her voice went quiet. "Could be his brother. Or one of his old friends." "Could be," Holden said. "But he's not coming here." Evelyn looked away. "You can't know that." "I can," he said, firm now. "You're not alone anymore." She stood, brushing her hands clean. Her voice was low, even. "What if that man has papers? What if he claims something over me?" "I've seen men bluff with old claims," Holden said. "But I also know the law doesn't own you. No one does." She stared at him. "You're not afraid of trouble, are you?" "I've lived beside it long enough," he said. "But I don't let it in my house." Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that the heat from the hearth brushed both their boots. "I've got no dowry," she said. No name that means anything. No promise I can give except that I'll rise early and fight for what's mine." Holden's voice dropped. "You ever think maybe that's more than most men ever get?" She looked up at him, eyes steady. "And you, what do you get?" He took her hand, thumb moving slow across her knuckles, rough and work-worn as his own. "I get you. If you'll have me." Outside, the wind shifted through the grass, bending the frost-silvered blades. Evelyn didn't answer with words. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against his, one breath shared between them. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat beside him on the porch, a blanket around their shoulders and the stars wide and watchful overhead. She leaned her head gently against his chest, listening to the rhythm of a heart that beat steady like fence posts driven deep, like cattle moving slow through open country. Holden kissed the top of her hair. "You're not passing through, Evelyn," he said. "You're home." And this time she believed it. The last calf was born on a windless morning just before the first snow. Evelyn found Holden kneeling in the straw beside the cow, his hands steady and sure, coaxing the slick, shivering creature into the world. He looked up at the sound of her boots, gave a faint nod, then turned back to the calf, rubbing its sides with a feed sack until it let out a thin, stubborn bleat. Hazel was with Hannah Tollefson for the day, helping churn butter and learning rhymes Evelyn didn't know herself. Henry had gone with Emery to fetch seed potatoes before the trail iced over. Evelyn didn't like the children scattered, but Holden had reassured her twice that the weather would hold and the roads would stay dry until nightfall. She crouched beside him and reached to help. Her sleeves were already damp from washing the porch railings that morning. The calf's wet hide clung to her fingers. "Healthy," she said. He nodded. "Third heifer this season. That ought to carry us through next year." Evelyn reached for a clean cloth and wiped her hands, then leaned back against the stall wall. Holden sat beside her, boots planted firm in the hay. "This place was built for more than survival," she said after a minute. "I see that now." He didn't look at her. "I was waiting for someone who could see it." The calf nuzzled its mother's side, legs still trembling beneath it. Evelyn watched the pair quietly. "I got a letter," Holden said, drawing a folded note from his coat pocket. "Came through the post rider yesterday." She took it, eyes scanning the neat, careful writing. A woman's hand. The name at the bottom read Margaret Callahan. "She your aunt?" Evelyn asked. He nodded. "Lives near Helena. She's getting on, and she's offered to sell me a small parcel of her land, said she'd rather it stay in the family. It's got a creek and good soil. Nothing fancy." Evelyn folded the letter again. "You thinking of leaving?" "No," he said. "I'm thinking of building, scouting timber this winter. Raising a second barn next spring, something set farther up the ridge where the sun breaks earlier." She looked at him, something careful in her expression. "You mean for us?" "I mean for a family," he said, "if you want it." When she didn't answer right away, he turned his head. "You don't owe me anything, Evelyn." "I know," she said, "but I want to stay beside you when the snow comes. I want to wake in a home that we made, not one we borrowed." His hand brushed hers, not by accident, not tentative, but with a quiet certainty. "Then say it," he said. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm staying." He nodded once, like a man who had already believed it in his bones. They walked back to the house as the sun slipped low between the cottonwoods, their shadows long and side by side in the dirt. Evelyn stirred the stew while Holden brought in the tools from the barn. The quiet between them was no longer uncertain. It was full and warm. By nightfall, Henry returned with his cheeks red and his coat dusted with frost. Hazel came in soon after, her hands full of dried apple slices and a story about a goose she'd named Margaret. They all sat at the table beneath the oil lamp. Evelyn ladled stew into bowls and Holden passed the bread. No one spoke much, but the silence was no longer cautious. It was the sound of something settled. After the children had gone to the loft, Evelyn stood by the hearth brushing her hair. Holden came up behind her, his footsteps soft. "You ever think about what comes after spring?" he asked. "I think about chickens and plowing and maybe a row of beans," she said, smiling. "And a wedding?" he asked, voice low. She turned to face him, her hand still holding the brush. "You asking me proper, Holden?" He took her hand and pressed something into it. A ring, plain gold, well worn. "It was my mother's," he said. "She'd wanted to go to someone who knows the worth of quiet things." Evelyn stared at it for a long beat, then slipped it on her finger. "I'll marry you come thaw." He exhaled like he'd been waiting to breathe. "Then we'll build that house. I'll cut the beams myself. You'll have help," she said. "We'll all raise it together." He kissed her, then not rushed, not uncertain, just strong and sure and full of the promise they had already lived into. That winter, the snow came early and deep. The cabin stayed warm with the fire banked high and the sound of Hazel's humming and Henry's whittling. Evelyn and Holden shared a bed built of pine, and each night they lay close, their hands tangled and their breathing matched. By spring, the ground thawed enough to start the foundation. Henry carried stones, and Hazel collected wildflowers for the windowsills. Evelyn marked out the rooms with her boots in the dirt. Holden built with a steady hand and a full heart. They were married beneath the cottonwoods with Emery as witness and Hannah Tollefson tying the ribbon around Evelyn's bouquet. Hazel wore a crown of dried wheat. Henry stood tall in a clean shirt Holden had sewn 2 buttons onto himself. There was no music, just the wind through the grass and a vow spoken once and meant forever. They built the new house together. Evelyn planted her beans. Holden raised the beams and hung the door straight. The children slept sound in their own room, and the porch faced east, so the morning light touched it first. And for the rest of their days, Evelyn and Holden rose early, worked hard, and came home to each other with hands full of the life they had chosen. Their love didn't flare sudden, it held steady, like the lantern on the table, like the stars above the ridge, like the land beneath their feet, and it never wavered. Not once.